So over the last few weeks, I've tested a lot of different roll recipes with the goal of making the ultimate cheesesteak roll. And in the last episode, I finally came up with a recipe that got me pretty close to what I was looking for. Now these are some cheesesteak rolls, but they still weren't perfect. Really, I think I just need to dial in that crust and we're pretty much there. One other gripe with this one, the crumb is probably a little bit more open than I would want. You can see there's some slightly bigger holes in here, whereas we want kind of a more uniform tight crumb without sacrificing that airiness. But since then, I've been able to fix most of those problems. I increased the oil content, reduced the hydration level, but above all, I made one more very important realization. So in the last episode, I talked about how decreasing the salt content should in theory increase the volume of the rolls, or in other words make them lighter and softer. So in my first version of this recipe, I'd gone all the way down to 1.8% from the typical 2 to 3% that was used in my internet recipes. And the difference was noticeable. My rolls were a lot lighter and softer than any of the other ones I tried. But then the other day this video popped up on my YouTube recommendations about how to bake banh mi at home. It's a great video, I recommend you check it out. But I noticed that in his recipe he only used 0.5% salt. And in the comments he said that's because it creates a much lighter roll. So I figured why not give it a try. And honestly, I'm pretty blown away with the results here. So this one is baked using my typical 1.8%, whereas this one uses 0.5%. I mean, look at the difference in volume here. And it's the exact same recipe otherwise. This one weighs 203, 202, literally within 1 gram of each other. So you can just imagine this one feels so much lighter and less dense. And obviously it's a lot softer as well. The question is though, what's it gonna look like on the inside? And is the flavor gonna be too bland? Wow, look at that. The crumb looks really nice. It's not like you have some giant holes, some small ones. I think the holes might be a little bit bigger than I would want. So maybe I'll try going up to like 0.7 or 1% salt, but let's see how it affects the flavor. So it's definitely a little bit less flavorful, but honestly for a cheesesteak, I think that's fine. I really don't think you need the roll to be super heavily seasoned. I mean, the cheese is pretty salty, and if we season the meat well, I really don't think you need the roll to have that much salt in it. But the other thing that struck me here is the crust on this one is so much crisper than the crust on this one. Not exactly sure why, maybe just because the surface here kind of stretched out more, became thinner, but this is a really good roll right here. Now these rolls were actually baked last night, but I just threw them in the oven this morning for about 5 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And they crisped right back up, pretty much good as new. But either way, this experiment definitely showed that using less salt is one of the keys to achieving a super light and fluffy roll. But what about the exterior? Because this still doesn't answer how I was able to achieve this super thin, crisp crust. And it's something I've been experimenting a lot with, but really it all comes down to one thing: steam. Let me explain. So the way that dough rises in the oven is that all of the gas bubbles that have been created during fermentation blow up as the gases inside them expand. So they keep expanding and expanding until the dough cooks to the point where the outer crust hardens and therefore the dough can no longer rise. So essentially if we can just delay the hardening of that outer crust for as long as possible, we give the bread more time to expand and rise, and therefore it'll end up airier and lighter. And that's where steam comes in. By hitting the dough with steam during the first few minutes of baking, it'll keep the crust soft for longer and therefore allow it to rise better. But that's not all, because steam also helps to gelatinize the starches on the surface of the crust, which leads to better browning. And without steam, the crust tends to end up thicker because it's able to dry out more. Whereas with steam, it can't dry out as much, and so you get a much nicer, thinner, crisper crust, which is exactly what we're looking for. But then the question is, how do we actually create steam during baking? Well, most bakeries use steam injection ovens, which are special ovens that can actually spray steam on the bread during the first few minutes of baking. I don't know about you though, but my oven can't do that. So as a home baking alternative, the recipes that I've tried so far have recommended this. Once you place your rolls into the oven, throw some ice cubes into a preheated pan, and then place that pan on the rack below your rolls. Essentially, you're simulating the steam that would be created by a steam injection oven. And this method does work to a certain extent, but it's far from ideal. So the problem with the home oven is that it's actually designed to release steam. It's got a little vent at the top here so that the steam can escape during baking. And so our steam pan method doesn't work super well, because if this is our baking tray, these are our rolls, and our steam pan is down here, most of that steam is just gonna go around the baking tray and up out this vent here. Some of it might get trapped up here, but not nearly as much as we want or need to achieve the right result. So what works a lot better is to use a covered pan to trap steam in. That's why if you've ever baked sourdough bread, the recipe probably called for you to use a Dutch oven. That's because the bread releases steam as it bakes, and this heavy Dutch oven lid is gonna trap that steam in so that the bread is basically steaming itself. And this method does work really well. Problem here though is we're trying to bake rolls, and rolls are not gonna fit into a typical Dutch oven. So for me, I actually do have a solution. I have this Challenger bread pan that works the same way as a Dutch oven, but it's just shaped differently so it can accommodate longer rolls. And it's what I've been using so far for this roll recipe. It works great, but the problem is it is very expensive. So honestly, I don't know that I could recommend it unless you bake a ton of bread at home. But that's okay, because I think we can come up with a method that's just as good and a lot cheaper. Alright, so I've got a couple prototypes here. The first is what I'm calling my ultimate cheap method. I don't know, I didn't come up with a clever name for it. But basically it consists of a baking tray, which you should probably already have if you own an oven, and a disposable roasting pan, which I got for like $3.50. And it works just like this. The potential problem I'm seeing with this method though is I'm worried the baking tray won't crisp up the bottom of the rolls quite as nicely as the cast iron would. And also, since this disposable pan is pretty flimsy, I'm worried that the steam's gonna be able to escape. But that's why I'm also gonna place a heavy cast iron pan on top to create a little bit of a better seal. But if all that still doesn't work, I've also come up with another method. With this one, I'm gonna replace the baking tray with my baking steel. And I'm gonna replace the disposable baking pan with this Detroit style pizza pan. The tighter the seal that it can form with the baking steel, the better, because obviously that just means it's gonna trap in even more steam. You do need to make sure your roasting pan is oven safe up to at least 500 degrees Fahrenheit though, so don't use something like this glass pan. But the main advantage of this setup, at least in theory, is that the baking steel should do a much better job of crisping up the bottom of the rolls. And since this baking pan is more robust, it should do a better job of trapping in the steam and transferring heat to the rolls. At least in theory, but we won't know for sure until we give them a try. But before we make these rolls, we need to talk about today's sponsor, Native. Native aims to make personal care clean and fun with products that are great for you. Their deodorants are aluminum and paraben free, cruelty free, vegan, and they're made with ingredients that you've actually heard of, like coconut oil and shea butter. And some of you may know, one of my favorite things to do outside of cooking is lifting weights. But with these hot summer months approaching, I don't want to feel sticky and gross every time I do it. Luckily, Native deodorant isn't sticky at all, so I feel fresh after exercise. So I've used the sandalwood and shea butter scent, and I've also used their eucalyptus and mint and their charcoal scents, all of which are honestly some of the best smelling deodorants I've ever used. Plus, they also recently introduced their candy shop collection, which is Native spin on some of your favorite candy scents like gummy bears, sweet cinnamon hearts, and strawberry and vanilla taffy. I've personally tried the Sour Berry Belts body wash, and on top of just smelling great in general, it actually smells just like sour berry candy, which is pretty cool. And using my link in the description below, along with the coupon code Anderson, you can get 20% off your first purchase at Native. This offer is available site-wide, but just for a limited time, so be sure to stock up and save. So thanks again to Native for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support. Now, let's make some rolls. Wow, so I think this experiment makes it pretty clear how big of a difference steam can make. These were all baked at the exact same temperature for the same amount of time. The only difference was the steaming method. And as you can see, I actually ended up making 6 different versions. So for all of these rolls, I first preheated the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit with my baking vessel inside for about 30 minutes. Then I brushed the rolls with water, followed by my sesame seeds, then scored the rolls and slid them into the baking vessel in question using a piece of parchment paper. And I also added 8 ice cubes alongside the rolls to create even more steam. So I baked with steam for 10 minutes, then without steam for 6 minutes, so 16 minutes total. And I also rotated the rolls halfway through that last 6 minutes to ensure even browning. Now the only exception to this method was contestant number 1 here, which I actually baked with no steam at all. I still baked it for 16 minutes though at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. I did cover it up with tin foil with about 5 minutes left though to prevent it from burning. But now let's introduce the rest of the contestants. So contestant number 2 was baked using my usual method, the Challenger bread pan. So this is basically the benchmark or the gold standard that I'm comparing against because I know this method works. Now contestant number 3 was baked using my ultimate cheap setup. Number 4 was baked using my upgraded setup with the baking steel and pizza pan. Number 5 was baked using the old ice in a pan method. And number 6 was also baked with the ultimate cheap method, but this time I didn't preheat the baking vessel. But now visually, we see some pretty clear differences here. So let's start with numbers 1 and 2. This is number 2 with the Challenger bread pan. You can see it's got that super thin, nice crust that we're looking for. Really nice crackle, nice rise in the oven. This is exactly what we're looking for. Now with number 1 that was baked with no steam, you can see a pretty big difference. There's almost no crispness on the exterior to speak of, and when you look at the crust, it's a lot thicker It's just a lot drier and chewier. So that one's out. And actually number 5 that was baked with the ice pan method looks pretty much the exact same. The ice pan did almost nothing to provide steam, and so we have that pretty hard crust again, almost no crispness, and overall just not an ideal result. So that one's out too. Now the elephant in the room here, my ultimate cheat method, looks pretty weird. I'm not 100% sure what caused that, but I do have a theory. I think that since the baking pan didn't get quite as hot, the ice cubes didn't evaporate as quickly, and so they kind of just turned into water rather than to steam. Because I could tell when I took the lid off, the rolls looked wet, which I had never really seen before with my Challenger bread pan. I think if we just use less ice cubes, or maybe even no ice cubes at all, we might be able to get it to work. But now let's look at our upgraded method. This is the one with the baking steel and the Detroit style pizza pan. I was actually shocked at how good this one turned out. I would say it's almost as good as the Challenger bread pan. I still think this one edges it out just by a little bit, but it got a really good rise in the oven. The crust isn't too thick. It's got that nice crispness to it. So this is definitely a great method if you do happen to own a baking steel already and you have some sort of roasting pan to use. And if you followed along with my New York style pizza series, maybe you already own a baking steel. But I still know not everybody does. So I want to do a bit more testing to see if we can get something else to work. Yeah, so I think I finally figured it out. Not just a steaming method, but I think I got every aspect of these rolls perfected. Soft interior, super thin, crisp crust. So let's make another batch and I'll show you what I did. First, I'll mix all of my dry ingredients. And this recipe will be on my website with the exact amounts of everything, but for now I'll just talk in baker's percentages. First, I just mix all my dry ingredients. So I'm using bread flour, and then I settled on using 1% yeast, 2% diastatic malt powder, and 1% salt. So still significantly less salt than we started with, but I found that anything less than 1% makes the rolls a little bit too light and holy. Now I'll add the water, and I found a hydration level of 59% to give me the best results. Any higher, and again the rolls kind of become too light and holy, and any lower, the dough won't be tacky enough to shape properly when we're trying to form the rolls. But now the last ingredient is the fat, and this is where I've made another huge realization lately. Because we know that the rolls from Philly that I'm trying to replicate use margarine. But when I tried it, it made the dough a lot harder to handle, and it was just sort of a hassle to use. But more importantly, it didn't even really make a difference in the final product. So I'd pretty much written off using anything other than vegetable oil until I saw this comment from Jack on my previous roll video. Because he mentioned using Crisco as a way to make the rolls softer. And after trying it, it definitely works. I mean, I've never made rolls this soft at home, and they still maintain that crisp exterior. And it works because Crisco contains mono and diglycerides, which are emulsifiers that help prevent the water and fat in the recipe from separating. I don't understand all the science behind it, but I do know that when I made rolls using normal vegetable oil, they did turn out noticeably greasier than when I used Crisco. With that said, you can use vegetable oil and the results will still be good, but for the best results, you want to use Crisco. And I use a baker's percentage of 10%, so I'll just add it at the same time I add the water, then give the dough just a few kneads to smooth it out. Now I like to let it rest in the bowl for about 20 more minutes. It is technically optional, but it's going to make it a lot easier to knead. And after about 3 to 4 minutes of rising, it should be nice and smooth and ready for our first rise. So I'll let it grow by about 1.5 to 2 times, and you can see just how extensible and smooth this dough is with that Crisco in there. Give it a quick shape, then I'll toss it back in the bowl, and what I usually like to do here is throw it in the fridge overnight or even up to 2 or 3 days. That's completely optional though. If you want to do this all in the same day, you can just leave it at room temperature and let it double in size again. In my case though, I'm back the next day, and we can see that mine has more than doubled, which is fine too. Divide it into the desired number of pieces, and let these rise until they're about doubled again. And if I'm doing multiple batches, I'll throw the rest in the fridge until I'm ready to use them. But once they're doubled in size, which for me took about 45 minutes, we can shape our rolls. And one other tip I got from that banh mi video I mentioned earlier is to actually roll the dough out using a rolling pin and to shape it into a triangle. This will pop any particularly large bubbles so that they don't end up in the final bread, and it'll help to make sure that the ends don't become thicker than the center. So just roll it up like so, close off the seam, and then roll it out, applying even pressure from end to end. And I like to poke the edges back in so that we end up with a more rounded roll rather than sort of a pointy baguette. Now we'll throw them onto a piece of parchment paper, which I've already lined with cornmeal, to let them rise one final time. And once they look like this and spring back slowly when poked, it's time to brush them with our water and then bake. And I've come up with 3 steaming methods that I'm happy with. I still think the best, unfortunately, is the Challenger bread pan. It's just hard to beat something that's specifically designed for bread baking. But I have dialed in the other 2 methods to get us pretty close to the same result for a much lower cost. The one you just saw me use is the baking steel method. For this one, I'll slide the parchment paper onto a pizza peel, then I'll add a few ice cubes in between the rolls. Then I'll slide the parchment paper off onto my baking steel, which I've been preheating on the second highest rack of my oven for at least 30 minutes. Then I'll quickly place my lid on, which in my case is is the Detroit style pizza pan. Just be very careful so you don't burn yourself here. And the rolls turn out great, almost as good of a crust as the Challenger bread pan. I went a little bit overboard with the ice here, which is why the shape is a little funky, but if you use just one ice cube per roll, or maybe even just one ice cube total, it works out perfectly. And actually, one advantage of this method over the Challenger bread pan is that you can bake more rolls at one time, or you can bake larger rolls since you have a bigger surface to work with, at least as long as you have a roasting pan big enough to cover them. But this method does still require some specialized equipment, so that's where our last one comes in. And it's an updated version of my ultimate cheap method from before, the only difference being that I don't include any ice. So this is the cheapest method, the easiest to maneuver since you don't have to handle any hot equipment, and the rolls themselves seem to release enough steam to achieve a pretty decent result even without the ice. Now with this method, I found that I had to bake at 450 degrees rather than the usual 500 to prevent the bottom of the rolls from burning. And I bake with steam for the first 10 minutes, and then without steam for the last 6 to 8 minutes. And I rotate halfway through that second portion. But now, for those of you that have been following the series up until this point, you notice that this is the more rustic style roll that I've been talking about. Not to worry though, I'm also developing a recipe for a softer Amoroso style roll, which I'll be talking about in future episodes. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you can click right here to check out the previous episodes of this Philly cheesesteak series. Otherwise, be sure to tune in next time where we'll finally be talking about the cheese, and you can watch that here once it's uploaded. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.